Tuesday evenings always had me on the go, especially on the second Tuesday of the month, when my Kiwanis Club meeting kicked off around 6:30. Anna and I usually didn't get home until sometime between 5 o'clock and 5:30. The Kiwanis meetings included dinner, so it was one night I didn't have to think about cooking. But, in typical fashion, Anna, my wife of 4 years, would always have a few last-minute chores lined up for me to take care of before I could even think about heading out. Now, that was the easy part. The real struggle lay within me. Anna had told me she was 3 months along in her pregnancy, her hormones in overdrive. She was still the captivating woman I'd married, and now, with that glow of motherhood, it was getting harder and harder for me to leave her, even for just a few hours. Anna was something special to me, standing 5 feet 3 inches, about 110 pounds, with soft light brown hair and these bright blue eyes that always had me hooked. Sure, her looks were part of it, but I loved her sharp wit and the way she could spot things most people missed. That beauty didn't hurt, though, I'll admit. Still, I had to be out the door by 6:10 if I wanted to make it on time, which meant a rush through a quick shower, throwing on slacks and a sports shirt, giving her a quick kiss and heading out. I rarely got back home before 11, sometimes closer to midnight. I didn't expect tonight to be any different. After hurrying through my shower, I threw on my clothes, grabbed my briefcase, and went through the kitchen toward the garage. I gave Anna a kiss on the back of her neck and a little squeeze to steady her, feeling that familiar pang of reluctance as I walked out the door. I was tempted to skip the meeting altogether, not just because I wanted to stay with her, but also because I had a project going in the garage, a baby monitor setup for our nursery to be. I'd figured it would only take me about 30 more minutes to finish it, and then I could show it off to Anna. She usually liked the little things I did around the house, and I didn't mind the praise. Hey, I was just a guy, and a bit of appreciation from my woman felt good. As I sat in the car, I hit the button for the garage door opener, started the engine, and set my briefcase on the seat beside me. I did my quick mental checklist: cell phone, calculator, notebook, all there. I backed out of the garage, waved at Anna through the kitchen window where she was washing dishes, and watched her wave back as I reached the street. But before I could switch gears, or even close the garage door, my phone rang. Answering, I glanced up to give Anna one last wave, but she'd already disappeared from the window. The voice on the line sounded pleased to have caught me, letting me know tonight's meeting was off. Leo, our president, along with Tom and Frank, had been called out of town, so the meeting was canceled unless anyone had urgent business. I felt an unexpected relief wash over me at having the night to myself. I eased the car back into the garage, noting that Anna hadn't come back to the window. Later, she'd tell me she hadn't left the kitchen, assuming I'd return soon enough. After pulling in, I closed the garage door and just sat in the car for a few minutes, letting the quiet settle over me. I thought I'd order pizza instead of cooking, giving me time to finish up the monitor project without rushing. The camera setup for the nursery was nearly done. I just needed to connect a few wires in the garage and run a final test. The nursery was ready in terms of looks, and the camera was discreetly placed in a corner where it had gone unnoticed by Anna for over a week. She'd once casually mentioned that a nursery monitor would be handy for checking on the baby during naps, which had nudged me into wiring the house. I even set up sound monitors in each room for extra peace of mind. I'd gotten the idea to add a video monitor from an old piece of equipment a friend was getting rid of. The main controls were in our bedroom, but I'd installed a second set in the garage, where I spent a fair bit of time, complete with speakers and an old TV that acted as the monitor. The setup allowed me to check on the nursery from just about anywhere in the house. With everything nearly done, I thought I'd finish it up, then maybe settle down to relax in front of the TV or spend time with Anna. Getting out of the car, I started inspecting the wiring. 20 minutes later, everything seemed to be working as planned. Testing the sound feeds, I found each speaker was sensitive and functional, able to pick up sounds from all over. I could even hear Anna in the master bathroom, the faint sound of her showering. Satisfied, I set all the speakers to feed into the garage and moved on to connect the video monitor. I'd gotten a bit caught up in the final checks when I heard a voice come through the speaker for the living room. It sounded like Anna, talking on the phone. Curious to know what was going on, I turned up the volume, and the sound came through crisp and clear. Those 5 speakers I'd picked up for $1, and change had really paid off. Through the speaker, I heard Anna speaking to someone named Henry, saying she'd appreciate if he could be there by 7 o'clock. Her words struck me like a cold slap. "It's on, lover," she said with a tone I knew too well. Henry replied smoothly, "All right, love, I'll see you then. And don't you even think about being late." He added that they wouldn't have nearly enough time as it was, and there'd be no second round. After a short pause, Anna let out a giggle and hung up. My mind spun. Lover? Henry? The only Henry the first knew was Henry Miles, married to Molly, Anna's best friend from college. I'd always liked Henry. He was a good guy, and we got along well. For a moment, I guess they were maybe planning a surprise for Molly, though why Anna would call him lover had me puzzled. I figured I'd find out soon enough. It was only 6:45. Shaking off the unease, I switched on the camera I'd set up in the spare bedroom, satisfied with the work I'd done on the monitor system. The camera feed showed the guest room's queen-sized bed, sheets neatly turned down. It surprised me. Anna didn't usually go to that trouble unless we had visitors coming. I adjusted the camera's focus, zooming in and out. At the widest angle, I could see almost the entire room. Door, window, closet, and the bed, all perfectly clear on the screen. With everything working as it should, I started cleaning up my workbench, feeling a slight sense of pride in the setup. I grabbed a cold beer from the old garage fridge, plopped into my cheap recliner. One Anna wouldn't let anywhere near the house but fit just fine in the garage, and relaxed. As I sipped my beer, debating whether to order a pizza or surprise Anna by finishing the monitor early, the doorbell rang. I heard Anna answer it, her voice carrying a strange excitement as she told the visitor, "Come on in, Henry. We have until 10:30, plenty of time." She practically purred, promising him she was all his until then. The words echoed in my head, but what shocked me most was her voice, the low, sultry tone she only used with me in our bedroom or on the way there. I choked on my beer, bolting upright in the recliner. I heard the front door close and then Anna's voice, teasing him that judging by the bulge in his pants, she wasn't the only one who was eager. The sound of her laughter cut through me, twisting my gut. My hands shook as I clutched my empty beer bottle, realizing she was leading him to our bedroom. I wanted to march into the kitchen, confront them both, throw him out. But it couldn't be real. It just couldn't. Anna and I were deeply in love, expecting a baby together. She was my best friend, my partner. Sure, we joke about harmless looks now and then, but I'd never once considered straying, and I believed she hadn't either. We were perfectly matched in every way. She'd always seemed satisfied, even reaching the heights of pleasure time and time again with me. My mind refused to accept what was unfolding. I slumped back in the recliner, sick to my stomach, but something kept me glued to the monitor. I saw Anna lead Henry into the room, guiding him toward the side of the bed by the window, while she moved to the foot of the bed, positioning herself by the closed closet doors, facing him and almost looking right into the camera. She was wearing an old robe, the one she usually lounged in on the weekends, but she'd pulled her hair up into an elegant bun, her neck looking slender and graceful with a hint of makeup on. She looked like a vision, almost like a princess, but the worn robe made the scene feel twisted, out of place. To top it off, she had on the high-heeled slippers I'd given her for her birthday, the ones I'd complimented her on. I couldn't remember seeing those since that night, and now here she was, wearing them for him. My eyes stung, and I felt the back of my throat tighten. This was really happening. My wife, the woman carrying our child, was here in front of me, preparing herself for one of my closest friends. She straightened, standing tall and proud across the bed from him, her eyes level and confident. Slowly, she lifted one hand to the collar of her robe, gripping it with her left hand, holding it closed. Then, with her right hand, she began unfastening each button, her movements unhurried, almost ritualistic. She kept the robe held closed, teasing Henry with tiny glimpses, drawing the moment out. Once the buttons were undone, her right hand returned to the collar, and with both hands, she drew the robe open, giving him, and, inadvertently, me, a full view of herself framed by the garment. She paused, letting the moment sink in, then shrugged her shoulders, letting the robe slide down her arms and fall into a pool around her feet. All I could do was watch, feeling my world collapse around me. She was dressed in the very lingerie I'd given her for Valentine's Day, a gift she'd modeled for me once, then tucked away ever since. She held Henry's gaze, lifting a hand to beckon him closer, her expression brazen and familiar. As he made his way around the bed, I caught sight of his stunned, almost disbelieving face. Stammering, he murmured that he'd expected a special evening with her, but she'd outdone herself. His voice took on a tone of admiration as he whispered, "God, you're beautiful." Both of them shed their remaining clothing, and the room suddenly felt colder and emptier than I'd ever known it to be. The shock wore off, replaced by a jolt of clarity. I'd need some kind of proof of this twisted reality unfolding before me. Moving quickly and silently, I went to the living room and grabbed a fresh SD card, my mind racing. Back in the garage, I slotted the card into the monitor and switched everything back on. The screen displayed them entwined, and tears blurred my vision as I watched them move to the bed, their bodies wrapped around each other in a scene that seemed to drag on forever. Henry, relentless, and Anna, seemingly lost in it. I paced around the garage, too sickened to keep watching but somehow unable to look away. After about 15 minutes, I noticed her starting to pull back, murmuring to him, "Henry, unless you want Ben to walk in on us, you need to go." She bent over to pick up his clothes, handing them to him before gathering her own discarded lingerie. She walked calmly to the dresser, setting everything down, and threw on that worn robe of hers, removing the sheets from the bed with such efficiency that it didn't seem to bother her at all that Henry was still half-dressed beside her. She bundled up the sheets and slipped out to the laundry room, leaving him standing alone. When Anna returned, Henry was waiting in the living room, wearing a self-satisfied grin that made my skin crawl. With a boastful tone, he told her it had been great and suggested they consider doing it again. Anna's reply was curt. She reminded him it was a one-time thing, based on their old deal. Henry chuckled and mentioned that maybe it was also for old time's sake, but she stood firm. She said if she ever thought about it again, she'd remind herself it was only meant to be once. I heard a sloppy kiss followed by the fading sound of his footsteps, her voice barely disguising her impatience as she followed him to the door. Through the haze of my emotions, I heard the soft click of the door locking as Anna secured it behind him. In another moment, I'd have found the humor in how exhausted Henry sounded after his time with her. But right then, I couldn't even muster a bitter laugh. My entire body felt leaden as I lay back in the recliner, eyes glued to the monitor showing an empty room that seemed foreign to me now, a place no longer fit for our child. I glanced at my watch. It was 10:37. They'd kept to their schedule with chilling precision. The sound of Anna's voice reached me from the front door as she said something to Henry in hushed tones. Her words pierced through. She told him it had been only for that one time, a remnant of some old agreement they'd made years back. I heard her remind him that I was her husband, the man she loved, the one she wanted by her side. She admitted she wasn't even sure why they'd done it now, especially since Molly, who'd apparently known and been okay with this, was still her best friend, more important to her than any affair. She questioned Henry about his loyalty to Molly, but I couldn't make out his reply. I heard another kiss, then the door quietly closing. The lock clicked home, and I slumped deeper into the recliner, feeling hollow and exhausted. The events of the night replayed like a nightmare I couldn't escape, and the sounds of Anna moving about the spare room reached me as she went over every detail, tidying up to erase any trace of what had happened. She gathered her clothes and disappeared down the hallway, eventually settling into our bedroom. I listened to the distant sound of the shower and, minutes later, the rustle of sheets as she climbed into bed. Checking my watch, I saw it was nearly 11. I sat there, staring into the emptiness around me, at a loss for what lay ahead. My mind churned with thoughts and questions, rationalizations that tried to excuse her actions, rebuttals that tore them apart, and, inevitably, self-blame. Had I done something wrong? Was there something she'd needed that I hadn't given her? Lost in a fog of pain, I finally stood up after midnight, switched off the electronics, and walked inside. As I entered the house, I passed the spare room, where just hours earlier, she had been with Henry. Everything looked just as I'd last seen it. The stripped bed, nothing out of place, No evidence of anything amiss. I let out a heavy sigh and went to our bedroom. My wife was sound asleep, or pretending to be. I went to the bathroom, brushed my teeth, and took care of the day's last tasks, stripping off my clothes and dropping them into the hamper. Oddly, it was empty. There were no signs of that lingerie. When I climbed into bed, Anna stirred, rolling over to drape an arm across me. In a sleepy voice, she asked how my night had gone. For a moment, I didn't answer. Then, I told her simply that it had been traumatic, but I'd explain later. Usually, she would have snuggled up close, but tonight she just lay there, quiet, pulling her arm back and rolling to face away from me. Her breathing was even, but I had a feeling she was still awake, listening. I turned over, too, staring into the darkness, trying to grasp the pieces of my shattered life and the woman I thought I knew. I don't think I actually slept that night. Just lay there, wide awake, my mind racing in circles. When the alarm finally sounded, I stayed motionless, too drained to face the day. There was no way I was going to work. I told Anna I must have caught the flu and just lay in bed, waiting for her to leave for work. As soon as I heard her car pull out, I forced myself up, my legs unsteady as I moved to her dresser. I opened each drawer carefully, making sure not to disturb anything. Then, in the bottom drawer, tucked away in a paper bag under some sweaters, I found the lingerie. The same set I'd given her for Valentine's Day, still damp in the lap. After calling in sick to my boss, I steeled myself to review the recording from the night before. I fast-forwarded at first, avoiding the parts one couldn't bear to relive, but as the footage played, new details surfaced, ones I'd missed in the shock of the moment. By mid-morning, I'd made 2 copies of the recording and placed a couple of phone calls to prepare for what was to come. Realizing I hadn't eaten since yesterday's lunch, I ignored the gnawing in my stomach. Anna came home at her usual time, around 4:30, and when she leaned in to kiss me, I turned my head, prompting a confused look from her. As the clock neared 5:30, I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. It was time to confront what had happened. No more delays, no more second-guessing myself. I asked Anna if she could spare a moment to check out the baby monitor system I'd been setting up. She brushed it off, saying she'd take a look after dinner, as she was just about to get started. Keeping things casual, I asked if she was in the mood for Chinese, and she agreed. After ordering delivery, I took her by the hand and led her to the bedroom, showing her the console I'd set up by the door. I left the sound on as I moved from room to room, communicating with her over the monitor. Though she couldn't reply, I could tell by her pleased expression that she was impressed. When I turned on the video feed, I told her to wait and watch. Heading into the spare room, I stood exactly where she'd stood the previous night, making a slow, mocking movement, and then returned to the bedroom. "Ben, that's perfect," she laughed. "When did you get this all going?" I met her puzzled smile with a level stare. "This afternoon," I said flatly, though most of it was set up last night. Her smile faded, replaced by a flicker of confusion, as though trying to recall exactly what she'd done. Taking her hand again, I led her to the garage. I explained that since I spent a lot of time out here, I thought it would be useful to have a monitoring station in case she needed to step out while I was watching the baby. Switching the system on, I inserted a USB drive into the monitor and told her to watch the feed. The screen showed an empty room at first, the bed unmade. But then I changed the channel, and suddenly we were looking at footage of her and Henry from the night before. She was on her knees in front of him, and I could see the color drain from her face as she swayed, struggling to stay upright. She looked at me, wide-eyed, and I just held her gaze, fast-forwarding briefly, then pausing the video. "Look again," I told her, directing her back to the screen. There was no sound, but we both watched as Henry reached for her lingerie, and I caught a glimpse of Anna's expression as she said something to him. Her face twisted in a silent scream, and I realized with a sickening clarity that it was pain I'd seen. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed tears beginning to streak down Anna's face, and she flinched as the video showed Henry's rough treatment. Pausing the video, I turned to her, my voice hoarse. "Do you need to see more?" Anna stared at me, helpless. I led her back inside, my mind set on having the talk we couldn't avoid any longer. We went to the kitchen, and I seated her at the table, taking a chair beside her. Through tears, She whispered that she could explain. I nodded, saying I needed an explanation, and asked her point-blank about this promise she'd made to Henry back in college. How many years ago did you promise yourself to him? I demanded. She started talking, her voice trembling as she said it hadn't been as simple as that. She and Henry had dated in college, she explained, even though he'd earned quite the reputation as a womanizer. When she began rooming with Molly, Henry had started seeing both of them, balancing his time between the two. But things eventually grew more serious between him and Molly. Anna went on, describing a late-night conversation she'd had with Henry in her room after they'd both had too much to drink. Things got more suggestive, and she admitted she'd told him that the only reason she hadn't slept with him was her fear of getting pregnant. Henry had always insisted his partners be on the pill, but she'd been hesitant to be so liberal with her affections, as she put it. That night, they'd argued, and in a haze of alcohol and frustration, she'd scribbled out a promissory note, saying that if she could be certain he couldn't get her pregnant, she'd spend a night with him. She paused, looking at me with a mixture of shame and defiance, waiting for my reaction as I stared back, speechless, struggling to grasp what I was hearing. How long ago was this? I asked, my voice barely concealing my frustration. She hesitated, but then answered quietly, about 6 years. Anna explained that the note had become a kind of running joke between her and Henry, something they'd laughed about over the years. She said that 2 weeks ago, when we shared the news of her pregnancy with Henry and Molly, things took a surprising turn. After Henry congratulated us, he and I headed out to the garage to check out an issue he was having. While we were gone, Molly apparently looked her straight in the eye and told her that now, with her pregnancy confirmed, the note must be due. Anna admitted she was stunned, not just because Molly knew about it, but because she seemed to expect Anna to follow through. By the time Henry and I came back, I'd forgotten all about the beer I was supposed to bring to their cookout, so I went home quickly to pick it up, leaving them alone. Anna said that while I was gone, Molly had brought up the note again. This time, she was surprised to find that Henry actually seemed to believe she was going to keep her word. He was even offended at the idea she might back out, acting as though her honor was on the line. After 3 hours of drinking, her last drink, she reminded me, until after our child was born, Anna found herself agreeing to this old promise. Before I returned, they'd arranged it all for the following night. Shaking my head in disbelief, I told Anna that this was one of the strangest stories I'd ever heard. I wasn't sure I could believe it. I looked her dead in the eyes and asked, "So who's the father of the baby you're carrying?" Her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. I felt hollow, but I pressed on, asking, "How many other notes like this do you have out there? How many have you honored?" She screamed at me, "None, Ben. There aren't any others. Don't you understand? I love you." Her voice softened, desperate, as she insisted it had only been that one time and that it would never happen again. She begged me to believe her, saying it wasn't something she'd planned or wanted, and she'd never thought of being unfaithful to me. Dropping to her knees, she covered her face, her whole body shaking with sobs. I stood there, heart pounding, and asked if I could ask her a few questions and get honest answers. Through her tears, she nodded, whispering for me to go ahead. She swore it was a one-time thing, that she didn't want it, didn't look forward to it. "It seems impossible now," she said, "but you mean more to me than my life, Ben." I looked down at her kneeling there, my stomach churning. This was the woman I'd thought would be my best friend forever, the one I trusted completely. But I had to know who she really was. I asked, "Couldn't you have just said no?" Anna looked away, struggling to find her words, then replied, "Yes, I could have. But my honor was on the line, and I was afraid to tell you. I didn't think you'd understand." She went on to explain that when the agreement was made, she'd been drunk, but it wasn't something she threw away the next day. "When I made that promise," she said, "I didn't know you. I wasn't betraying you. It was something I did for a friend I thought would always matter to me." After a pause, I asked if she had really believed it was a debt she owed, one she had to fulfill because of who Henry had been to her back then. She nodded, affirming that's how she'd rationalized it. I took a deep breath, trying to contain my anger, and asked, "So, over the past 2 weeks, were you looking forward to it?" She hesitated, her voice trembling as she admitted She'd started out thinking it was just a joke, not something she'd actually go through with. But as things unfolded, I realized it was real. Yes, I was nervous, but I felt like I had to go through with it. And if I did, I told myself I might as well enjoy it. She insisted it was never about me, that it wasn't because I wasn't enough. I just thought, she whispered, if it had to happen, I'd make it special because it would never happen again. Exhaling slowly, I steadied myself and brought up a memory from about 6 weeks ago. I'd called her while driving home from a conference, suggesting we meet at a hotel for a weekend getaway. We'd flirted on the phone, and she'd agreed. "Do you remember?" I asked. She nodded, her voice shaking as she admitted it had been a great weekend, even giving me a weak smile. I pressed further, asking her to recall what she'd packed for that weekend. She looked at me, confused, and said she brought a nice dress in case we wanted to go dancing, along with some comfortable clothes. I told her to hold on a minute. I needed to show her what this was all about. I walked out to our bedroom, checking halfway down the hall to make sure she was following. She stood there, watching as I turned on the bedroom TV and prepared to play the footage. With the remote in hand, I pressed play. The image flickered to life, revealing her and Henry, and I steeled myself for what would come next, hoping against hope that somehow she'd understand the gravity of what she'd done. The scene on the monitor unfolded with Anna still kneeling in front of Henry before rising and turning to the bed, her movements captured perfectly by the camera in the corner. "What were you wearing?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. Blushing, Anna admitted it was the white lingerie I'd given her for Valentine's Day, the same set she'd only ever worn once before, as a model to show me the gift. She muttered something about not having had the chance to wear it again, then faltered, looking puzzled. I reminded her that she hadn't worn it for our weekend at the Holiday Inn, only bringing along her usual comfortable clothes, like her cotton underwear and the Donald Duck t-shirt she'd slept in that night. Looking straight into her eyes, I pointed out that for our romantic weekend, she hadn't bothered with anything special, while with Henry, she dressed in one of the most beautiful things she owned. She shrank under my gaze, slumping her shoulders. I continued, telling her that if I didn't love her, we wouldn't be sharing this house or this life together, and if I didn't think she was truly special, we wouldn't be married. Then, I recounted the awful twist of fate that had canceled my Kiwanis meeting the night before, sparking the worst nightmare I could imagine. While I should have been at that meeting, Henry, one of my closest friends, had shown up at our home, where Anna welcomed him at the door, leading him to a room she'd carefully prepared for their encounter. She dressed up, styled her hair, applied makeup, and presented herself in ways she hadn't done for me in over a year. I couldn't ignore the effort she'd made, the care she'd taken, and how it all seemed to scream that this moment with Henry meant something to her. It left me feeling that time with me had become ordinary, something of much lesser value. She tried to deny it, tears filling her eyes, insisting it wasn't like that and professing her love for me. I just looked at her for a long moment, feeling torn. Finally, I sat down on the bed and told her I wasn't sure where we would go from here, but I planned to call Henry and Molly over to talk things out that evening. I needed answers, and I wanted the truth from everyone involved. I asked if Molly knew about everything, then dialed their number. Molly picked up, and I invited her and Henry over, telling them it would just be a brief chat. As I spoke, Anna went to answer the door for the Chinese food delivery. I barely tasted my own meal, but forced myself to eat, knowing the evening ahead would take a toll. Anna picked at her food, and for a moment, her reassurances about it being a one-time mistake and her devotion to me almost seemed believable. Yet, deep down, doubt gnawed at me. At 7:15, the doorbell rang. Before answering, I told Anna that I sensed there was more to the story than even she realized. I opened the door to Henry and Molly's cheerful smiles, but beneath their casual greetings, I felt a strange tension. Henry's gaze on Anna was possessive, his expression bordering on smug, and I noticed Anna shrink slightly under it as we moved into the living room. I motioned for her to sit on the couch beside Molly, but she chose her recliner instead, distancing herself. For a while, I rambled on about my new monitoring system, avoiding any mention of what I'd seen the previous night. Molly and Henry listened, clearly puzzled, and Henry eventually asked why they'd been called over. Smiling tightly, I offered everyone a drink to ease the tension. Molly's usual white wine, Henry's Jack and 7-Up, Anna's orange juice for the pregnancy, and a tonic water that looked like gin and tonic for me. I took a seat on the hassock, needing to maintain some distance to keep my composure. After studying each of them for a moment, I asked Molly directly why she'd pushed so hard to set this up. She looked genuinely puzzled and asked what I meant. I clarified, questioning why she had worked so hard to bring this situation about. Henry, caught off guard, choked on his drink, sputtering as I turned to him. "I can guess what you got out of this, but is there more to it?" I asked, glancing back and forth between him and the two women. Trying to find his footing, Henry began defending himself, saying he'd been at home last night when Kiwanis was canceled, working on something in the garage. "Is that so?" I asked with a forced smile, noting the convenient timing. He looked uneasy, glancing toward the TV in the corner. I couldn't resist a small, bitter laugh as I remarked on the clarity of the feed and the irony of its setup. Anna buried her face in her hands, and Henry's face turned pale, while Molly simply looked at me, her lips curling into a strange, almost smug smile. The tension in the room thickened, and I knew I was finally on the verge of learning the full truth. I turned to Molly, barely containing my frustration, and asked her outright, what exactly was the point of all this? She crossed her legs, her foot bouncing nervously, and countered with a question of her own. "What do you think it was about?" I took a breath, noting her reputation and Henry's, then mentioned that I'd heard a few things at Kiwanis but hadn't taken them seriously, until now. Molly sighed, admitting that this wasn't the ideal way to address it, but she agreed it was time to be upfront. I glanced at Anna, who looked utterly bewildered, and I realized she might have had no clue about any of this. I explained to Anna that Molly and Henry had been involved in what they called a key club for a couple of years. Every Friday night, they'd meet up with a group at Barney's Broiler. Each couple would bring a house key marked with their address, dropping it into a barrel like the kind used in bingo games. After dinner, the wives would head home, while the husbands would take turns drawing keys from the barrel, each one determining who they'd spend the weekend with. The rules were simple. If a man drew his own address, he'd hold his key in his left hand and draw again, putting his wife's key back in. Some men even allowed themselves 2 draws, just in case they picked someone they'd been with recently or didn't like. But once they drew the second key, they were committed, no matter who it was. Then, they'd have a drink and set off for a weekend tryst, an entire weekend away from their marriages. According to rumors, Henry and Molly had suggested to others that Anna and I were somehow involved, and apparently, several of the men, not just Henry, had taken an interest in her. The room was dead silent as I laid all this out. Anna stared at me, shocked and pale, while Molly wore a smug little smile, her foot still bouncing. Henry, meanwhile, sat back, looking slightly smug himself, as if relieved the truth was finally out in the open. I broke the silence, looking straight at Anna. "There's something you should know about Henry, your lover from last night." Her face drained of color again as I continued, and she looked as if she wanted to vanish. I mentioned Henry's reputation as the prize of the Key Club, the one all the wives supposedly wanted to draw. Anna looked mortified, and I noticed her sinking deeper into her chair, her face going red. Henry just sat there, grinning like he'd won the lottery, while Molly exchanged a smirk with him and then glanced at Anna with barely concealed satisfaction. I took a long drink of my tonic, which tasted as bitter as the bile rising in my throat, then let the silence drag on. Henry looked like he could burst with self-satisfaction, but Molly's expression shifted as if she had something more to say. Finally, she broke the silence, explaining their arrangement as a way to keep the spark alive and prevent their marriage from getting stale. She claimed that introducing new people into the mix could actually make a couple feel closer afterward. Henry's grin widened as she went on, and she assured us that there was no pressure. It was entirely up to us if we wanted to join, and they'd be there whenever we decided. When she finished, I looked her dead in the eyes and, with barely concealed disdain, told her that I appreciated her patience, but I hadn't discussed this with Anna, nor did I have any desire to. I told her we had no interest in swinging or finding other partners. Anna and I explained, were well-read, thoughtful people who didn't need any outside influence to keep things interesting between us. I looked at Anna as I said I hoped to share many more years together, just the two of us. My tone darkened as I addressed the real issue, Henry's lack of safe practices. I told them both that Anna, now pregnant with our child, would need to see a doctor to check for STDs. We'd have to avoid any intimacy until we were sure she hadn't contracted anything. I watched Anna's face as I said this, ensuring she understood just how serious this was. I turned to Henry and Molly, feeling an overwhelming sense of betrayal. I didn't know which of them I was angrier with, but I made it clear that our friendship had been shattered. As I powered off the TV, I ejected the USB drive, walked over to Anna, and handed it to her. Anna gathered up several sheets from the day's untouched newspaper, crumpling them and tossing them into the fireplace. Striking a match, she set the paper ablaze, then added the USB drive containing the evidence. Together, we watched the fire burn down until there was nothing left but charred ash. I turned around to see that both Henry and Molly were now unconscious, slumped on the floor. The chemical worked, I commented calmly, then picked up the phone and called Davis. 3 hours later, around 11 p.m., the doorbell rang. I let Davis in, nodded toward the two limp figures on the floor, and confirmed, "The package is ready." Davis gave me a questioning look, and I gestured toward Henry and Molly. Davis stepped outside and returned with 7 more men. They picked up Molly first, moving her toward the door. But as they moved to lift Henry, I held up a hand, stopping them. Heading upstairs, I retrieved a baseball bat and explained to Davis, "I just need a few swings." Davis nodded, and Henry was set down on the floor. I directed my hits with precision, kneecaps, ankles, and a few other key points, all delivered quickly and without hesitation. Anna stood there, mouth open in shock. "I would have liked to hear him scream," I muttered, glancing down at Henry's unresponsive form, "but unconscious will do." The men took both of them away, and Davis stayed behind for a few minutes, sitting down with me before leaving. He thanked me for the samples, to which I replied that it had been my pleasure. Anna was still seated, mouth slightly agape as Davis left. As the cold night settled in, Anna approached, visibly shaken, and asked, "What's going to happen to them?" My voice was flat and detached as I replied, "They're going to Mexico. Medical students need subjects to practice on." She looked at me with wide eyes, asking what would happen if anyone came looking for them. I reassured her that Davis would handle it, adding icily, "They'll be eliminated if necessary. I don't particularly care what you think about it." Anna trembled, and I continued, stating that I had no reason to feel guilt. "I've ensured their contribution to society now," I finished, watching as she absorbed my words in silence. I then told her that my earlier mention of rekindling a physical relationship had been a lie. The following morning, we'd conduct a DNA test on the unborn child. If the test confirmed the baby was mine, I'd help her through the birth, but we would no longer be married. I added that she'd remain celibate until our son turned 10, or I would see to it that she was put to good use. We'd file for divorce immediately, with her keeping the house and receiving financial support until she found a job. Anna nodded, seemingly dazed, surprised at this side of me. I turned and walked away, quietly saying, "I didn't know it existed either." The next day, we filed for divorce, and 3 weeks later, the DNA test confirmed I was indeed the father. A few months after that, the divorce was finalized, and 2 months later, my son was born. I poured myself into fatherhood, spending as much time with him as I could, though I kept my conversations with Anna brief. I knew I could never love her again, though she held to the agreement, staying single and refraining from any relationships. For 5 years, I supported her financially, ensuring my son had what he needed as he grew. I focused entirely on him, refraining from dating, channeling all my energy into being his father. Davis later expressed his gratitude, sending me a substantial thank you gift, and, as promised, no one ever came looking for the samples I'd sent his way.